Hi, today I will be discussing the role of education in combating terrorism. My question was whether or not education is effective in combating terrorism. Now, I will be discussing this first in terror-conducive countries and in Western countries, and finally I will provide my conclusions. So first, a bit of background on terrorism. Although we see a decline in the number of terrorist attacks in recent years, there is an overall increasing trend in terror attacks. And in 2016, we saw $84 billion in global costs from these terrorist attacks and over 34,000 deaths. Now, given these impacts, terrorism is a significant issue which must be dealt with. Okay, so first, terror-conducive countries. So this is a country which generates a large amount of terrorism, so for instance, Syria or Afghanistan. Now, these countries tend to have fewer civil liberties and also poorer economies. Now, education has often been proposed as a magic bullet to solve terrorism by people such as Malala. However, when we actually look at the numbers, we see that this hasn't been fully effective. In fact, based on a poll of Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza Strip, we see that higher levels of education are actually associated with increased support for terrorism. So Brockhoff et al. Suggest a number of potential reasons for this. For one, more educated people tend to be more politically motivated, and as such, they will try to seek political change. However, with fewer civil liberties, they resort to terrorist groups in order to effect this change. Also, when you get an education, you expect that you get rewards in the form of increased income because of the education. However, in these countries, this isn't always true. So instead of seeking a legal job, they seek a terrorist group in order to receive those increased rewards. Now, not only are these people susceptible to terrorism, we see terrorist groups are actively trying to recruit educated people. So these are a series of pictures of ISIS operations, and we see that they're running an Islamic court, they are running a bureaucracy and producing and selling propaganda videos. All of these of course, require educated people to do things like act as a judge or edit these videos. Now, in Western countries, we see a number of high-profile terrorist attacks. So, for instance, Charlie Hebdo or the Orlando shooting. And in the wake of these attacks, the question was, how can we prevent this from ever happening again? The question wasn't, notably, whether these attacks justified. And this is really important because it shows the hostile environments in these countries towards terrorism. Now, this can be attributed partially to education because, for one, education and schools provides an environment for integrating people into society. And when a person is integrated into society, they're less likely to attack other people within that society. Now, not only that, education promotes a cosmopolitan worldview and an acceptance of diversity, and as such, people are less likely to be hostile to people different from themselves and are more likely to accept these differences. Now, furthermore, education in schools promotes critical thinking. Now, this allows individuals to come to conclusions independently of terrorist propaganda, which generally leads them to reject these terrorist ideals. And finally, given the increased significance of social media as a terrorist recruitment tool, teaching media literacy in schools is also significant in combating terrorism. Now, furthermore, education is significant in that it provides information about these terror-conducive areas. Okay, so as Abu Lughod points out in her interview, in Western countries, people tend to oversimplify these issues, and this is dangerous for a number of reasons. So first of all, if we had good information regarding these areas, we would know more about the root causes of these terrorist attacks. So for instance, Abu Lughod notes a number of these following 9/11, such as US intervention in the region along with the history of invasions in Afghanistan. And by knowing these root causes, we are able to deal with terrorism at its source. Furthermore, any activities by Western governments in these regions requires a good understanding of the issues of the region so that the government doesn't blunder around and lead to increased hostilities by people in that region. So, conclusions. So first of all, we see that education can work, such as in Western countries. We see that there's an environment hostile to terrorism, but the conditions necessary for education to be effective are not present in terror-conducive countries. So we see few civil liberties and an economy which does not reward education. So as such, education can be implemented, but it has to be used in conjunction with other strategies in order to be effective. So first off, the content of the education should be looked at. So Brockhoff et al. Failed to mention the actual content of the education in the survey. So what happens is the education may not necessarily promote the diversity that it needs to. So one way that this can be addressed is by using eyewitness history in curricula. So as Schlesinger notes, eyewitness history is particularly good at capturing the sentiments of a particular time, and as such, it is able to promote a more open worldview by exposing students to different opinions. Secondly, internal as well as international pressure should be applied in order to create a political system with more civil liberties. And finally, we should invest in these economies to promote an economy which rewards education. Of course, all of this is very expensive, and state building is very difficult. The US has tried this, but of course this just leads to, again, education is significant because we need to have an understanding in order to successfully implement these solutions. Thank you very much.
Okay. So, let me ask you a couple of questions. All right. So, how did your research question evolve as you went through the process, and did you go in a different direction?
So my original research question had nothing to do with the topic. It was actually about augmented reality, but I looked into that and it didn't seem particularly friendly to research. So I changed to terrorism, and initially I looked at just what are effective means that Western nations can use to combat terrorism. But then I decided to narrow it down because there's just a lot of information about that, so I changed to education specifically.
All right. And so how do you, okay, so when you're talking about these solutions, right, how do you think that would look in, say, one of those environments if you implemented it?
So one of them is we are in a school, right? And as such, any changes to the education in here would directly impact the curricula that like you and I have to deal with, right? So this could be things like looking at more media. I know that's one of the things we do in seminar, right? So promoting and having more students take seminar, things like that. Also in other classes, especially social studies classes, this could be looking at more primary sources and as well as eyewitness history accounts.
All right. Thank you, sir.